Well, welcome. It's good to see you. My name is Tim Lee. I work for Fresh Expressions Limited as a networker and facilitator, and I'm delighted to have three guests here with me today, doing the last in our series, sadly, of Missio Dei in a Digital Age. But it is excellent to welcome Maggi Dawn, Alex Chow, and Pete Phillips. Thank you. It's great to have you here. It would be really good if you could just let us know where it is that you are listening to us or watching us from. That would be great. So as we could just, if you want to just post that in the chats, that would be grand. And we're just going to, we'll do a little bit of an introduction to people. And then Maggie's going to kick us off with some stuff which is kind of centered around the digital space and worship, what that looks like, and then Alex will follow on. Then we're going to stop for some questions from that. So if you've got your questions, if you want to post them in the chat, that will be grand. And then we're going to kind of round up with Pete, who's going to finish with some thoughts about where it is that we might be going in this post-COVID time. So I think, well, he used the word inspiration, so I think that might be, I'm really looking forward to what it is that he's got to say. So brilliant. So yeah, if you've got comments, Anthony, great to hear from you in Macclesfield. Welcome in. Brilliant, Christopher. I know you've been a part of these conversations, I think, from Sweden. So really good to have you with us again. And thanks for joining in with us. Maggie, just tell us a little bit about yourself. I see that you've got a whole that now. I have to confess my musical ignorance of this. Are they guitars in the background, violins?
Yeah. I am in the studio here, and those are guitars and basses behind me.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So whereabouts are you? What are you doing? What's your role at present?
I currently live in Durham in the northeast of England. I fairly recently returned from 8 years in the United States, which was absolutely fab. That's where one of my guitars comes from. I am in Durham. I'm the principal of St Mary's College, which is part of the University of Durham, and professor in the Department of Theology and Religion. And I think I'm sort of connected here partly through Pete, of course, who's a longtime friend, and also because I was a founder member of Holy Joe's, which going way back was one of the things that kind of got Fresh Expression started at the beginning. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Great. Well, it's great to have you here with us. Alex, tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on this panel. So I'm an American, if you could tell from my accent, but I'm in exile in Scotland. I live in Edinburgh. I've been here for coming up to 8 years. I teach in the university in the School of Divinity. I do theology as well as world Christianity. And world Christianity is basically a big catchword for Christianity in the non-Western world, if you will. And I am also one of the directors for the Center for the Study of World Christianity at the School of Divinity here.
Brilliant. Well, welcome. And finally, Pete, good to have you with us. And just, again, tell us a little bit about yourself and, yeah, the context in which you are at the moment.
Hi, yeah. So I'm Pete Phillips, and I work in Durham. That's where I'm at the moment. But also, I work here at the Durham University as director of the Centre for Digital Theology. So we're doing lots of conversations about digital theology, and I mean, the church making use of digital so powerfully has been a huge research area for us all year. I also work for Premier Christian Media, work half-time there, and help Jonas have you out with a MA in Digital Theology, which we now run at Spurgeon's College. So lots of things that I'm up to. Brilliant.
Great. So I know that each one of you has written a chapter in the book Missio Dei in a digital age. So we're going to, each one of you is going to kind of share. Oh, there we go. Yeah. And
where's your copy, Tim?
Yeah. If you do want to have a copy of that, I know that
Tim, do you need a copy? Do you take mine? Is that...
yeah, thanks. And I know that there's an offer on at the moment. If you want to order a copy of that, I think we'll make that available for you, so that if you want to get a copy of the book, you can do. Okay, before we get going, Maggie, it would be great if we could just kind of kick off. If you want to keep your kind of comments where it is that you're from, you can do that. That's fine. But Maggie's going to talk for about 7 or 8 minutes from a particular perspective. We'll then hear from Alex, and then we'll stop for questions. So if you've got questions during this period of time for Maggie and Alex in terms of what they're going to say, then please do so. So go for it, Maggie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for showing up this lunchtime. It's really lovely to see you here. And from Macclesfield and Somerset and Old Spring Harvest connections, I can see that's great. And from Sweden. Hey, Kristoffer, hvordan går det? Jag snackar norska, jag tror du förstår mig. So what might church life, worship and mission look like post-pandemic? That's what we're kind of looking at here. And there's been a huge amount of comment all over the media about how we can't go back. And of course, much overuse of that dreaded phrase, the new normal. But the idea that you can't go back is absolutely the trajectory of Christian theology. The idea of salvation in Christ is not one of patching up what went wrong, but remaking it into something that was better than before. And the idea of Christian destiny is not to go back to the garden or round and round in circles, but onward to a garden city. Again, onward to something that was better than before. So I'm really invested in the idea that despite the fact that the situation we're in has been undesirable, painful and tragic, we might find in it not silver linings exactly, but something redemptive as we emerge from it. And one of the biggest and most exciting possibilities, I think, is that institutions that previously were very slow to engage in online platforms have just been pushed into it by necessity. And I've seen this in my work at the university in Durham, and I've also seen it in a huge number of churches who've been in touch with me to say, you know, quick, we've got to do this, we don't know how, please help me. It bears saying, I think, at this point, that while some of us have been doing this kind of thing in different formats for a long time, for many people, it really has been brand new territory and they've had to learn it in a big hurry. And rather than criticize those attempts, even if they weren't very good at the beginning, I just want to take my hat off to people who have been on that very steep learning curve, just trying to at least have a go. And to recognize what one professor at Duke University said last month, based on analyzing data about how people have coped with the pandemic, he estimates that everything during this pandemic, everything in life and in work, is approximately 30% harder than it normally is. So if you're tired and weary, there's a good reason why. It's because you're carrying extra burdens. And if you've been doing new stuff online, well done, bravo. There is no criticism here. But one of the things I've talked about with various church groups over recent months is how to navigate online platforms as a space or a place, rather than just a means of broadcasting. It's really noticeable to me where church has gone well or not so well, that it doesn't work quite as well when it's engaged simply as a temporary means of picking up a familiar experience and kind of putting a camera in the room and trying to transfer that into living rooms everywhere, pending the time we can all get back to normal. But it really does work when online space is understood as a different kind of space, from the usual space, and time is taken to make the worship or event site-specific. I just want to throw in an important qualifier here, because I've mentioned this once or twice before, and people immediately jump to the conclusion that what I mean is that you have a life that's divided into online and offline. That's not what I'm talking about here. You have one life, and the dichotomous approach has long been left behind by people who are switched on to this, that we have a consistent life. And if you have a consistent online presence, then that's part of your life, even when you're not actually connected to your gadgets. You just have one life. But you do, if you think about it, constantly flow between different spaces all the time. So, for instance, in my kitchen, I cook and eat and relax with my family and friends, laugh a lot, say silly things. In my studio here, I paint, I create music, and I write stuff. And at work, I have professional boundaries around what I talk about, not the same as in my kitchen. In public, I just carry myself slightly differently. In my study, I introvert completely while I read and write. And I'm the same person in every space. I'm not 5 different people, but a different part of myself comes to the fore in each of those cases. And each space can help me function better as an artist, friend, cook, lover, teacher, musician, etc. Especially if the space is set up conducively. So talking about space, I'm not talking about personal identity or whether you have an offline life or an online life. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that the success of online church depends on understanding online platforms as a particular kind of space, rather than merely a means of projecting my church into your living room. Understanding space really matters for church, wherever you are, and whatever kind of worship or event you're putting on. If you set up a series of worship events in perhaps a cathedral, a garden, the back room of a pub, and a living room, then the success of each of those largely depends on making them site-specific, making the most of the ambience, the acoustics, the backdrop, the atmosphere of the place, the relative sense in that specific place of either perhaps transcendent awe or intimate encounter, different in a cathedral from a living room, different in a garden from a beach, and the potential that there may be for interaction and participation in any of those places. And the prevalence of online church during lockdown has made it more glaringly obvious than ever that understanding place and space completely affects our experience. So let me give you some examples just to bring this to life. A friend of mine, somebody I was at college with long ago, had absolutely never used online anything before. She was really very unconnected, unusual in this day and age, but there we are, that's where she was. And she found it hugely stressful all of a sudden to have to deliver her services online, all alone, without her congregation, and very camera shy. She just put a camera at the side of her room and then delivered the service exactly as normal. There were problems because, first of all, without a congregation, she didn't sort of come to life like she usually does. But more than that, when I signed into her service, it just felt like she'd not got the concept that I was there with her at all. And it felt like I was just watching her at work, but there was no connection between us. By contrast, there is, in fact, a large and ancient cathedral less than a mile from where I live. And they have done very little in the past by way of broadcasting worship, except for things like when the BBC shows up to come around and broadcast Evensong or to make TV shows, that kind of thing. But they all had iPhones or Androids or whatever, different kit, and they weren't afraid to use them. And some of the clergy there asked me to help them think about applying some of the ideas that I'd presented, among other things, at Pete and Jonas's conferences. And we talked about stuff like, where do you put the camera so that your face is in the screen? And how do you consciously talk to the people who are in the room with you, in the online room, so that they don't feel like they're watching you far away, but they are with you in the moment? And acknowledging them in introductions and prayers. If you can speak their language, do it. I think I just managed to justify my own existence there. But introducing things like text-based or comment-based responses so that people could add their own prayer requests or amens or prayer emojis or whatever. So that was just enough to get them off the starting blocks. And they then brilliantly began to develop their own online space, adding all their own ideas and figuring out what works. And the result was something like this. Before lockdown, pre-lockdown, their morning prayer was attended every day of the year by those who live in and around the cathedral, the clergy, the musicians, vergers, and just a few locals who would show up day by day. But very rarely more than about 10 people in total on any given day. The very same morning prayer, same time of day, same set of people initiating it, after a few months of lockdown and online worship, it's now consistently attended by between 130 and 150 people. Let me say that again. Pre-lockdown, 10 or thereabouts. Now, 130 to 150 every single day. And these people are joining worship. I'm not going to say watching, because they're not watching. They are joining worship from all over the world. Some of them, it's actually evening where they are when they sign in, or it's the middle of the day. But nevertheless, there it is, and they want to be there. And as a response to that, the cathedral have now set up a global online prayer community, physically based at the cathedral and supported by their staff and resources, but operating worldwide and operating in online space. There have been quiet days, there have been short talks, and there's much more to come. And around 200 people now belong to this community that simply didn't exist before. Now, this sense of global interconnection, I think, is one of the most exciting things about what enforced online worship on a much larger scale has delivered for us during this time. It's not just Church A committing themselves to pray regularly for Church B on another continent. It's now interpersonal conversation consistently between churches all over the world. In February alone, I interacted with either preaching or doing panels or prayer conversations or whatever with churches in 4 different UK cities, 4 states in the USA, and in New Zealand. Now, if I'd tried to travel there in 1 month, I just couldn't have done it. But in each of those spaces, there was a much bigger concept of who we are as church, and the community has stretched. I hope we don't lose that. I really hope we don't lose that when it's possible to go back to what we might have thought of as normal pre-lockdown conditions. The other thing, though, that is worth saying and just sort of hanging on a peg in our heads while we think about this is that although there is recognizably a huge amount of potential benefit in holding on to this online reality, and I really don't want to lose it, it's also true that there are hundreds, thousands of people everywhere who are just desperate to get back to physical in-person meeting. People all over the world, both at work and at church, are zoomed out and screen weary, and they have entirely recognized that although online connection is brilliant and real, it's hard to imagine how we'd have kept going without it, actually. But it is different qualitatively from in-person contact. A slightly different thing happens. It's not a bad thing, it's just a different thing. It's a different space and a different experience. So my hope is that we might have learned not only a few things about how to do online church better, and I'm sure we can talk more about that in this hour, but also learned that online and offline space really do function differently. And I would love us to be ready to think about how to do better, both at navigating online space in a site-specific way, and also at making church life site-specific in physical spaces as well. I did write some about that, why live streaming sometimes absolutely doesn't work in the book, Pete's lovely book. But I think I should stop talking because I've used up my minutes, and I want to hand over to Alex and hear what he has to say.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you. Alex,
go for it.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's always daunting to go after somebody like Maggie, with her instruments and eloquence in what you have to share. And actually, for myself, I should have mentioned earlier that Before I went into theology, I spent about a decade working in the software industry. So I'm actually an engineer by training. And so that's actually what stimulated my interest in sort of the digital theology area. But also that leads to my own way of thinking, which is much more structured and linear than Maggie's more poetic style. So I apologize for that. In any case, this is an online panel, so I thought I'd just limit my comments to 4 points, a 4-point sermon, if you will. Not very Baptist, but 4 points that I have. The first one is I was thinking, and I think in many ways this springboards off of what Maggie was saying, that the switch to the online and the use of online technologies actually forces a paradigm shift in how we do things. I mean, I've been teaching in the university, and all the teaching has to shift, online or hybrid or whatever. And it's like, well, you can't just lecture like you used to lecture. You actually have to change it around, or you completely lose your students in this case, right? But the same thing with the church. You can't just do church the same way. It requires some real shifting in the way that we do things. And this is not only in the practical sense, but also in the way that we address aspects of ministry from preaching to pastoral care and theologically and so forth. So the first area that I wanted us to consider is maybe a slightly odd one, but it actually is connected to my chapter in this book, which is the question of surveillance. Now, my chapter in this book is a little bit different, perhaps from some of the other chapters. It talks about the case in China. I do a lot of research on Christianity in China and how Chinese Christians have evolved in their understanding of mission and increasingly using digital technology to promote this. And this is what I talk about in this chapter. But of course, this is China. And with China, not only do you have the rise in Christian use of technology, but that parallels with the rise in government use of technology. The government's use of technology in internet censorship, the so-called Great Firewall of China, as well as AI technologies and surveillance. And these, but I think that it's important to recognize that these are not just issues about societies like China out there, right? But they are questions that are raised in any society, Western societies like the US or the UK. A lot of people have hoped that the internet would be a great equalizing platform, a platform that offers a democratic voice. But in practice, with the increase in the use of digital technology, and not least during the pandemic, we are increasingly aware that much power is actually in the hands of multinational corporations, which have created their own forms of censorship and also collect our data for targeting search results and monetizing advertisements. So while mission is increasingly shifting to the digital space, what we do is constantly being curated by governments and corporations. And this is actually quite unnerving for many of us. I don't know about you, but it's unnerving for me. And I'm very careful of what I put on social media, even though I do post from time to time. But I'm very cautious about that. And perhaps when we're thinking about Missio Dei, the mission of God in the digital space, we may try to think about ways that we're trying to project ourselves or the church or the gospel message in certain ways, and think about SEO keywords or using certain technologies over others. But I think it's important. There's a theologian by the name of Eric Stoddard, and he says that Christian response to surveillance must involve a deeply practical appreciation of the contingency of God's world. What does this contingency mean for us? Well, we are reminded that mission is less about what we as individuals and churches can achieve and can project in the world. And therefore, we don't need to actually overemphasize the perfectionism and the preoccupation with strategizing the message and the media, getting everything right. We are reminded that this is the mission of God, who is sovereign over all places, both physical and digital. In a way, this connects to my second point, which is about the ways in which the internet technologies break down physical borders. And I think Maggie already brought up this point in a way, that churches which have shifted to online services have often seen a significant growth in their reach, and many after COVID want to include some kind of a digital presence still because of they've tasted all that's good in the internet, if you will. One church that I spoke to has seen a 10 to 16-fold increase in online viewers when compared to their pre-COVID weekly attendance. And many churches are also finding that they're drawing in audiences from around the region or nation and around the world, like Maggie was saying. So I was talking to one church leader in Hong Kong, for instance, and he was reporting about how they had this huge spike in online viewers coming from Canada and Australia, and we're talking vastly different time zones, right? And in the UK, I've talked to church leaders who've mentioned how their churches have created life groups and alpha groups for those joining in from continental Europe or the United States. In the post-COVID world, much of this will stay, but it does raise interesting questions for Christian communities, whether it's a parish church or maybe a cathedral like Maggie mentioned, which historically saw their role in mission in terms of the local geography, right? On the flip side, church ministries need to adapt to the differences that those various global contexts now raise. There's contextual questions in these other parts of the world that are very different from the questions that are being asked within your city, right? And it highlights an awareness that the digital shift creates new possibilities for evangelism beyond the limits of space, but also highlights how Christianity offers hope in times of adversity, and the anonymity of some online platforms serves as a means for some to explore religious faith in a non-threatening way. This leads to my third point, which is an indirect consequence of these developments, and that is an accentuation in digital inequalities. As we are increasingly dependent on faster processors and faster broadband connections, others are left behind with a lack of access to these same technologies. And I'm not just talking about money and the ability to buy something. I'm also talking about parts of the UK where stable broadband is not even attainable. Or those who struggle to find the unmute button on their Zoom call, those who are lost technologically, right? We should be mindful also of the great diversity which exists, in the UK, for instance, in terms of socioeconomic levels or experience levels with technology, or the different ethnic populations which represent a significant and growing proportion of British Christianity. There are differences in the ways that people use technology and the sources of the information which influence, for instance, whether or not somebody is willing to take a COVID-19 vaccine, right? God's mission transcends these differences. And if we choose to be part of the Missio Dei, the mission of God, we need to reckon with these differences. My final point is actually quite a simple one. And that is, it's about our relationship with the rest of creation. This is, of course, not new, and is even considered one of the 5 marks of mission in the Anglican Communion. But in a COVID-19 and a post-COVID-19 world, we have all collectively invested in new gadgets and new habits, whether that be in takeaway food or Amazon deliveries or Netflix binge watching. All of these things have an ecological cost. And as the theologian Randy Woodley puts it, I think he puts it very beautifully, that we need to seek the shalom in the community of creation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex, very much. Your chapter is different, but I really enjoyed reading it in the book because of that difference, actually. And I found it I found it worrying, actually, if I was perfectly honest. And it was something that, yeah, really made me stop and think. So thank you. And thank you, Maggie, as well. So Z317 Music has asked this really interesting question about workload. So it might be really good to just kind of, I don't know whether you want to dip into that, Maggie, and take that as the kind of the first question.
I think it would, yes, I think it's always true in work development that if you're going to do something new, you have to figure out either am I going to hire somebody to help, or am I going to stop doing something else, because you can't just keep adding more and more and more stuff. It's also the case, I just read this last week, a professor at Duke University had been analyzing data on how people have responded to and dealt with the pandemic and the conditions it's thrown up for us, and found that he estimates that every single thing we are doing right now at work and in life, everything is 30% harder than normal. So if you're feeling weary, there's a good reason for it. And I think it's one thing to have a vision and say that's what we'd like to do. That the next step after having a vision is then to work out, well, then how much of that can we make reality? Yeah. And if we're going to make it a reality, maybe part of what we do is to step back and say, well, in the in what we were doing before this happened, are there elements that are less fruitful that perhaps we should just stick on the shelf and do some of this instead? I'm very committed to the idea that you should put your energy where things are flourishing. If something is going brilliantly, then don't, I mean, if you've got an online prayer community of several hundred people that has somehow emerged out of nowhere in the middle of this, don't just dump them and go back to church because you can. Well, that's just dropped in my lap. What am I going to do with that? But it is absolutely true that you then have to find out what you're not going to do. Or, can you hire somebody? Can you get a volunteer? Can you join forces with the church next door and combine resources? But don't kill yourself. That is not part of the plan.
Yeah, good advice there. Don't kill yourself.
Oh, I've been doing this a long time and I've tried that part.
It generally doesn't work.
It's not worth it.
Alex and Pete, I wonder if you've got any kind of comments on that as well.
I mean, I think I would just echo what Maggie said, and I mean, I mentioned Eric Stoddard and his understanding of surveillance and stuff like that, but I think what he says about the contingency, is actually quite true in all these matters, right? And in terms of I realize when in Scotland we had the announcement of lockdown in January. And I have to homeschool my kids, my primary school kids, and I got to work from home. It's like I got to drop stuff, and you just and be okay with it, and that's scary to be okay with it. But it's and I think with our kids, we've been praying with them and just asking just asking God to be sovereign over all that we do, and it's really in many ways it's trying to relinquish that that responsibility. We do have a responsibility, obviously, and I think the times are shifting, and we're being baptized by fire with technology at the moment, and a lot of it will be around in a post-COVID world, and so there's a level in which we need to be responsible and need to be engaging it. But at the same time, there's things that really have to fall by the wayside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Go on, Pete. Yes, please.
I just I'm interested in what happened, when the church decided, when the Romans decided that the basilica was the new form of church, when everyone had met in people's homes before, and you kind of didn't need a caretaker or you didn't need a cleaning squad and what have you. Then we must have had similar questions then. Or, in the evangelical revival, when we started opening millions of chapels all over the place. I used to live in Aberystwyth in mid-Wales. There were more pew places in chapels in Aberystwyth than there were in, I think, the population of Wales at the time. Just crazy. It's absolutely crazy. It's huge tabernacle buildings with loads and loads of people all competing for the few people who lived in Aberystwyth at the time. So each version of technology comes along and kind of provides a new form of doing church. And in a way, we've got to do that kind of shift around in saying, how do we deploy ministry? How do we deploy finances? How do we deploy this in order to ensure that the kingdom benefits from this, rather than simply the past, rather than simply saying, well, we'll do what we did before. Perhaps it's time to rethink that. And it's deploying people where God's calling them to. And just getting out there and doing it and saying, actually, God's got to look after the old stuff. Yeah. Or perhaps not God, perhaps it needs to be left to be old. I don't know. Maggie looks as if she's going to come in there.
Whole theological definition of Missio Dei is, what is God doing in the world?
Yes.
Rather than what can we do for God in the world?
Yeah.
So it turns the question around. And so I think this is a good time to take a step back and say, right now, what is God doing in the world? I'll go and join in with that. Instead of saying, I need to go back and make everything work like it did before, because, find out where the Spirit is and go with that. Of course, that sounds very simple conceptually. It's much harder to do in practice. But I think that's a principle to keep going back to, really.
And I think so. Lucy's just put in the chat about when the printing press came in and hand-scribed books. Now that's really interesting, because hand-scribed books are now one of the most hand-scribed letters, in fact, one of the most privileged ways of communicating. It's an elite process, and hand-scribed books was an elite process. And I just wonder whether that might be a similar kind of shift, that we need to keep some forms of intensely physical worship. For example, we may want to develop more of Forest Church. We may want to kind of go back and look at cathedrals. We may want to kind of look at the choral tradition and so on, and say these things need to be focused on. But it may be that it's kind of gathering, what's the best to take forward? Where's God really moving, as Maggie said? And some things will have to be left by the wayside.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to go to this question from Christopher.
We love this.
Which I think is a cracking question about what is the church's involvement addressing the issues around digital poverty. And I wonder if you have any kind of comments which you'd like to make into that.
I'm thinking, first of all, it was one of the things that when I was writing for Pete and Jonas's book, this book, in fact.
Oh, no, have you got a copy of that, Maggie? Wow.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Pete. No, but jesting apart, I did a whole pile of stuff digging back into Missio Dei, because I remember studying this at university about 154 years ago. And Missio Dei was a discourse that began as a response to missiology that was a kind of bossy colonialist way of doing mission, where one culture not only took the gospel to another culture, but imposed the culture with it. And Missio Dei was a kind of pulling back from that and saying, no, it's not our job to go and make everybody into nice English people or nice Welsh people or nice whatever, wherever you were going from. It's our job to engage with other people in the gospel on the assumption that God is already at work in the world and that we don't have it, the whole thing. And I think digital poverty, to me, for the first place it rings for me, is not to assume that it's better to be online. It's great to be online if that's your culture. And if that is your culture, you need to figure out how to make the gospel work in that culture. But that doesn't mean that you have to go and impose it on everybody else. So I think we have to be imaginative enough to think that we are in a digital age, but not everybody is equally connected in an online identity. And some people really are not online at all. And that is an equally valid way of being human. That doesn't, though, address poverty in the sense of, if you think that somebody is in digital poverty and they prefer not to be, then what do you do? So that's another question. That's really a charitable and philanthropic question, perhaps. What do you think, Alex, Pete, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring a very important aspect. I mean, it's really the question of is there a developmental process, right? Do we go from all oral to all of a sudden a print culture, and then all of a sudden a digital culture, and that's the linear evolutionary progression of life, right? And that everybody has to go digital is the ideal, it's right next to heaven kind of a thing, whatever, it's moving Godward is to move digital, and I think that would be a deeply problematic way to look at things. But I think at the same time, when it's really when I talk about the digital inequalities, I'm not talking about it as fully a good or bad kind of a question. You're better or worse like this. I think it's really to highlight the differences that exist in different clusters of people. Even people who are very digitally versed may not be engaging with digitality the same ways that you may be engaging with digitality. Yeah. And but I think for those who as we are needing to evolve in how we think about doing mission, the mission of God in the digital space, we have to also take into account how to be involved in the mission of God in the non-digital space when everybody else is moving towards the digital space, and just negotiating those two facets of it.
Yeah, I think Louise here in the chat and Sally have both got it right there, that we have to acknowledge that some people do not want to go digital, and that is okay. Yes. And you can still be a fully qualified human being without being a digital person.
Yep.
That's what I mean by culture, that we must never make the mistake of saying, just because I like being online doesn't mean that's the best way of being human or the only way of being human. And it doesn't mean that if I am going to share the gospel with you, and when I say share the gospel, I mean you share it with me as well as I share it with you, a two-way process. It doesn't mean that my way is superior. It means that we operate in different cultures, just as if I was talking to somebody who comes from, I don't know, Mongolia, let's say. One of my students is from Mongolia, and a lot of our chat is about how different our lives were before we arrived in the same city. It's interesting, it's illuminating, and it's helpful to think how it makes you think about what it means to be human when you meet somebody else who's human and doesn't live like you. So, yeah, Louise and Sally especially, yeah.
Yep.
People think it's pointless and they're paying you wages. Well, of course, that's very practical, diplomatic and political issue there. So, yeah.
Thank you. I wonder if we should just, I want to give us space and time to interact with what it is that Pete's going to say next. But I think there's been some good conversations. So thank you. And particularly, Lucy, it's great to have you with us, even though your internet connection is really poor. But thank you for your contributions, some really interesting kind of comments. So thank you for that. So I'm going to hand over to Pete to talk and to give us some, I suppose, a perspective, which I think probably is about, orientating us and asking some questions around where we go to next and some thoughts around that. So thank you, Pete.
Yeah, cheers, thanks. So at Synod the other day, the chair shared a word of wisdom. The pandemic
you might need to just help people understand what the word synod is.
Oh yeah, synod, a group of ministers who come together to be told and to share in fellowship together. So at a church meeting the other day, the chair told us, shared a word of wisdom. The pandemic hasn't broken us, it's broken us up. The first bit is at best a half-truth. The pandemic has broken things. It's fatally broken 124,000 lives at least, and devastated so many others from grief, poverty, desperation, and loneliness. That's just in this country. It's broken our economy. It may have broken the viability of many of our churches. We lost lots of people who decided the pandemic was an opportunity to have a sabbatical from church, to break their habit of church going. And surveys suggest that up to 30% of congregations may well have drifted off. Will they come back? But the second half of that phrase, the pandemic has not broken us, it's broken us up, is a wonderful insight. We've been broken up like soil prepared for planting, broken apart and made ready to receive the seeds. The pandemic has been a time when God has prepared us for the new thing. Look at all the discipleship activities that have been developed, the very ones that Maggie was talking about before, and the fantastic work that's going on with Durham Cathedral, but there's so many other places as well. More people praying, more people doing spiritual support groups, more people reading their Bible, more people being creative, more people bathing in God's awesome creation, things that have already been mentioned by Alex and Maggie beforehand. As we've moved from enabling physical church to happen on screen, just kind of setting the camera up and filming physical church as though that was taking it in the right direction, and then extending that offer into hybrid models of church where we match digital and physical provision, or where we've extended pretending to be broadcasters into building a community online, which is what we should always be doing. We've also begun a process of disruption, opening up the ground for new things to grow, for new opportunities for people to engage with God, for new ways to share the love of God with all people. And of course, I'm not saying that new things can only happen in digital. You know, one of the other books that I've been involved in during this time is this little book on hybrid church, which talks about the way in which we might set up physical and digital churches. And that one, I asked 3 people who I thought were going to be hugely digital to share their experience of pandemic church. And their model was physical. Their model was of a Catholic priest walking into a village with a colleague and allowing people to watch them do a rosary service in the middle of the village square while people were watching on their iPads and their mobile phones around the place, with young people running around advising people how to get on and being the kind of techie warriors. Of Jo Cox-Darling working in Codswell in the West Midlands, of putting an easel outside her garden gate with badges for care workers or cups of tea for tired people, for people to pick up and share. Or getting Rick Stott to paint angels in public places in Codswell for people to go and stand in front so they could become an angel as well. Bryony Taylor stuff up in Chester Street, where she kind of has these phone sermons, which became a place where people could encounter a human voice by listening to her sermon. Absolutely fantastic. But I think that we need to think of ways that God has opened us up for new opportunities to do what we do best. In what way are we prepared as the soil, prepared as the soil which will bear new plants, new fruit, new harvest in the post-pandemic world? How's God preparing us during this pandemic time? And that flips over to the whole thing about saying, what are you doing during the pandemic? You know, we're all working our socks off, 30% harder for us to do anything. And yet I wonder whether the core thing that we should be doing is stopping and thinking and spending time with God and saying, God, will you till this soil? Because this soil needs preparation for what the new thing might be. At the same time, there was a joke at the beginning of the pandemic when churches closed and people showed a cartoon of Satan, a Latino Satan for some reason, saying he shut the church down with just a microvirus, and a nice white bearded God replying that he'd actually opened a new branch in every house. Poorly visualized, but a great joke. We need to remember that our network digital society allowed the church to go online. or rather allowed those of us in offline church to join the thousands already engaged in online ministry, often the disabled, the chronically ill, the housebound, those scared of coming into a crowd, those who had been abused by church. The opportunity that the shift online has given us cannot be downplayed. When in our research at Durham University with Savanta Comres, 24 to 28% of people are now engaged, of the general public, are now engaged in online organized devotion. Okay? Are attending online worship perhaps, at least once a month. Many of them young people. Some of our figures suggest half of all young people, young adults, are attending online worship of some kind. Many of them saying that we've provided a safe place to encounter the church. The phrase that the go-to phrase is that we've provided a sofa behind the back pew, a place where they can come and encounter the church on their terms rather than on ours, because churches are such scary places to come. Well, we have rows about whether the digital church is real church. People are dropping into our online presence and seeking to hear about God, to encounter God, to see if God encounters them. They couldn't care less if the church has validated digital church. They've just found a safe place to find their answers about God, and they're coming in their droves, seeking to hear about him, to encounter him. People asking John Drain when he offered spiritual care on the NHS up in Scotland. They weren't asking him about the kind of doctrines of the church or what's a vicar or a minister, what's the difference between them and things like that. But they're asking, how do I pray? How do I address God? If I get my words wrong, is God going to smite me? God has incarnated himself again on digital. God has made himself present online, where in fact he has been ever since the first networks were developed in the last century. God is a networking God, but he's there, he's present, he seeks us to follow him and meet the people who are dropping in looking for him. The power, the possibility, the privilege of being engaged in digital ministry when people are using the very tools that so many people are engaged in. And thank God for those like Jay Kim, who wrote this book, The Analog Church, during right at the beginning of the lockdown. I don't like this book, and I told Jay I think he's mistaken in some of the stuff he says. And Jay and I need to have coffee together if I get to Los Angeles sometime. But Jay wants to keep Grandma's church, which is a place of encounter and meals and sharing. And I stand by him and say, that's great. Let's do that as well. But where's the new normal taking us? I hate that phrase. This is the new normal. Where we are at the moment, I fear, is the new normal. We're in the midst of an extinction event, which includes humanity. This is reality. David Attenborough warns that pandemics are likely to be more frequent, just like disruptive weather. We've destroyed creation, and we will now reap the horrors of that. So we need to be remembering that this may be something that we need to stick with for the rest of time. If there is a new normal, perhaps you need to call it God's new adventure. For us to embrace hybridity, the physical and the digital together, as different, not opposing ways of doing church. To use every medium possible to share his presence, to connect people with him, to offer online spirituality and ritual which engages people's hearts and minds, to do ritual in a way that is appropriate for the digital room or space, as Maggie was saying, to develop effective alliances around climate care, creativity and social justice, so that we can walk humbly with God and act justly at the same time, to allow people to put their hearts into action in our decaying world. This connected world, this network world, is a great place to build those effective alliances. We are called to be ambassadors, disrupted disruptors in a disrupted world. Thank God that he's broken us up, opened us up, soil ready for God's new planting, in God's new adventure of pioneering a new thing. Are you coming?
Amen. Thank you, Pete. There's a real challenge there. It seems appropriate just to be silent for a moment, actually. Let's do that. Okay, we've got, overwhelmingly a wow, clapping, I'm on my way in terms of the feedback. I wonder if there are any kind of additional comments which Maggie and Alex you would like to make in kind of in response to maybe what Peter said.
Well, you know, Peter's put the some of the huge challenges out there, and they are real challenges. I think I was asked recently to write for a book about ecological extinction, climate extinction, and I wrote that right off the back of writing for Pete's book. And I think my response to all of this pandemic, you know, the likelihood that we might have to face this kind of thing again, I think the one thread to hang on to is that the gospel is always, always about hope.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of talk about destruction and despair, and it's all over and it's going to end and we caused it and it's our fault, blah, blah, blah. And in one sense, that's kind of true. You know, if you go look at the science, like, this is not a pretty picture.
Yeah.
But the gospel is about hope. And God will not leave us defenseless. God will not leave us alone. And we do not have to despair. That's my, you know, I think I started the session by saying that the thrust of Christian theology is always that you move forward. You're not going backwards and you're not going round in circles. You're always going forward. And that redemption, theologically speaking, is always about ending up better than it was before. And that is the hope of the gospel. And right now, we're so weary with all this pandemic stuff. It's been hard. And it's not just tired, like I'm tired, I want to go to sleep, but a weariness of dragging it all along. And I think we need perhaps to finish the hour by reminding ourselves that the gospel is always a gospel of hope, and God will not leave us alone. I believe, to quote scripture, I believe that I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, whether that's on an online platform, in a physical church, whether it's in grandma's church or in my grandchildren's church. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living.
Thank you, Maggie.
I mean, if I could just piggyback off that, I mean, a passage in the Bible which really resonates for me is in Acts 1, where Jesus is promising of the Holy Spirit. He says, you know, you're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, the ends of the earth. And actually what you see is that they stay in Jerusalem. The disciples stay in Jerusalem, and it is because of disruptions, persecutions, and so forth, that they actually spread. But it is by the power of the Holy Spirit that they spread, and they multiply, and they change the whole fabric of what it means to be church. And you know, is Facebook our, you know, Judea, Samaria, you know, is Twitter, is TikTok? Well, I don't want to think about TikTok, but, you know, are all these different things, you know, so it is a breaking up, but it is a breaking up for good, and that God uses that, and God empowers us in that through the power of the Holy Spirit. So I very much agree and echo what Pete and Maggie have said.
Great. We're coming into land in terms of kind of our time together and these three conversations. So I want to thank you for each one of you. Thank you, Maggie, Alex, and Pete for your contributions today. The book is out there. Please go and get a copy of it and have a good read, because it is a good read. I can tell you of that. Here we go. Here it was. Right on cue. Thank you, folks. But I have a sense of certainly kind of for Fresh Expressions and our kind of increasing our involvement. It doesn't feel like this conversation has finished. And actually, it will continue to evolve. And I think in any way which we can help that conversation to continue to evolve, then we will do, because I think the continuing thoughts and the processes and what that looks like in terms of practice are really, really important. So thank you for all of those contributions. Thank you for those of you out there, because I thank you for those comments. I think a really good comment there, and Pete has responded. Thank you, Sally. Glad that you are encouraged, and I think those words of hope from Maggie at the end are particularly kind of important. So bless you on your way. May you be filled with hope of the Lord Jesus Christ at this time, and thank you for being part of it. And yeah.
Tim, can I thank Fresh Expressions for hosting this series of seminars? They've been really good and really kind of helped us to kind of rethink how we apply this work to Fresh Expressions and pioneering ministry.
It's a pleasure. I mean, yeah, and again, moving forward, how do we do that? I'd love for us to continue this conversation, because I think it's going to be a really important conversation moving forward, and what that might look like. So yeah, kind of a debrief for us, I think, would be really good. But yeah, we're signing off. Thank you, everybody. If you'll be able to watch it again on Facebook, on YouTube, and a reminder that next week, the third one in our series about rewilding, with a whole host of wonderful people, will be happening next Wednesday at 12:30. Lucy Moore, Ed Olsworth-Peter, George Lings. So again, a really good conversation for you to watch out for and to join in with you, join in for next week. So take care, God bless, and this is Fresh Expressions signing off. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.